Hallå, hallå? Är den på? It's on. Welcome. Are you all seated? Lovely. My name is Katarina Tracz, and I'm the Deputy Director of Frivärld Forum, that is Frivärld in Swedish. This is the first panel session, and I will just briefly introduce the first speaker. The rest will introduce themselves. It is Edward Lucas, who is editor of the international section of the newspaper The Economist. And the agenda is that the panelists will speak briefly, 5 to 7 minutes each. I will ask some follow-up questions after every speech, and then we'll have a discussion between the panelists, followed by questions from you. So please, Edward.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Katarina, and thank you to the organisers. I've been covering the so-called East European region for getting on for 30 years now. I don't actually like the phrase Eastern Europe, and I don't like the phrase new member states. When Sweden joins NATO, perhaps we can talk about Sweden as a new member state of NATO. I like hostile questions much more than friendly ones, so please, if you want to disagree with me, do so aggressively. And I'm also free tomorrow morning if anyone wants to have a more extended punch-up session. I'm very sceptical of the idea of a Baltic security complex. I think we possibly have a series of Baltic security neuroses, but we don't yet have a complex. We don't have a complex actually in the academic sense, so I take that to mean a shared threat perception and some kind of shared and interdependent capability. And I think that within the narrow confines of the region's security analysts and Russia watchers, we probably do have a shared threat perception, and perhaps within this room we may have pretty much a shared threat perception. If you study Russia closely, it's really quite hard to be complacent, let alone optimistic about what's going on, unless of course you're getting large amounts of money from the Russians, which may shape your perception. But I think if you look around the region, we still have a lot of naivety and a lot of complacency about Russia. People extremely unwilling to believe that in Europe of 2013, we again have a hard security problem on the northeastern flank of the main Europe and EU security arrangements. We've really got used to the idea that this is all okay, that there's no need for hard security, or if you do hard security, you do it in places like Libya. It's an expeditionary capability, but the idea that we're still looking at territorial defence 20 years after the end of the Cold War strikes many people as anachronistic and offensive. Unfortunately, it is the case. We don't spend enough on defence, and one of the really striking things, I think, about what Artis Pabriks said, which is all absolutely true, but this is a country, Latvia, which is in the absolute front line of what I called in my first book, the New Cold War. It's a mixture of menacing hard power manoeuvres and a lot of aggressive soft power. This is a country which has managed to get into NATO, which is absolutely brilliant and something I worked very hard for, which is asking the other countries in NATO, particularly the United States, to risk World War III on its behalf. And it's so scared about this threat from the East that it spends 0.9% of its defense, of its GDP on defense. Its southern neighbor, Lithuania, which is, if anything, even more exposed. If you look at the sort of security, the scenarios for potential conflicts, Lithuania is heavily exposed because of the Kaliningrad transit issue. Lithuania is so scared about this threat from the east and from the south that it spends 0.8% of its GDP on defense and expects other countries to risk World War III on their behalf. And of course it gets worse when you move further away, because you have countries that have effectively disarmed altogether, countries in NATO that really don't have any effective defense capability at all. We dismiss the Russian threat at our peril, and I just want to give you a few very brief bullet points about why we should mind. It's not just the anti-Russian, the anti-Western rhetoric which you see spewing out of the Russian state propaganda machine, both in English and in Russian. And if you haven't watched Russia Today, I do urge you, just turn on Russia Today and spend a day watching Russian Today to see what the way the Kremlin is talking to the rest of the world. If you read Russian, even better, look at the stuff that comes out on the media inside. But it's not just that. We also have more political prisoners in Russia, certainly than we do in Belarus. By my count, I think we have more political prisoners in Russia now, just at this moment, than we had in the past 25 years. You know, it's not since Gorbachev started letting people out of the Gulag, you've never had more than maybe half a dozen. And there's usually with some extra twist, like there was an espionage case or it was semi-commercial or whatever. You now have dozens and dozens of people locked up on political grounds. You have show trials. We're seeing the Bolotnaya trials going on at the moment, the Navalny trial. We have people who are banned from leaving the country in substantial numbers, again something that we were unfamiliar with since Soviet times. And we've got censorship and much more besides. But it's not just a Russian domestic problem. We also have a broad spectrum attack on Russia's neighbors. It's a mixture of cyber, energy, information, military, diplomatic, financial, espionage, and criminal. And we tend to put all these threats into different categories. The Russians don't. I had a very embarrassing conversation with our security agency when I was writing my second book about Russian espionage, about why they hadn't followed up Anna Chapman's dodgy businesses. I guess you all know who Anna Chapman was. She was the famous Russian spy because she was a young woman who had red hair and breasts and had sex, was therefore much, much more interested than any of the other Russian spies who were caught in 2010. And she ran what looked like, to me, a money laundering business in London when she was there. And I asked RMI5, why didn't you follow this up? And they said, our job is catching spies, not criminals. But what happens when the spies are also criminals? So we're facing this very broad spectrum approach, which we try and deal with either rather selectively and partially or not at all. We should be taking a lot more seriously. It particularly affects the Baltic region for reasons that artists spoke about. It's asymmetric. We don't think about Russia very much. They think about us all the time. It was very interesting during the latest spy row when this hapless CIA officer was trapped and humiliated on Russian television. This was a really, really big deal for the Russians. This was something that was top of their political and diplomatic and information warfare agenda, was to show how they'd caught and humiliated the CIA. The Americans basically didn't care. The Americans interested in only one thing, which is the northern distribution route. Everything else doesn't matter. Russia is not on Obama's desk. The West is on Putin's desk. To some extent, it's almost the only thing on Putin's desk. He needs to bash the West in order to create the narrative that justifies the theft of tens of billions of dollars from the Russian people year after year after year. We are in the Baltic region all in the same boat. An attack on one country has profound effects on all the others, and it doesn't really matter whether that's a hard power attack or a soft power attack. I guess everybody here knows about the Zapad 09 exercises and the Zapad 13 exercises which are happening this year. I'll just refresh your memory. The Zapad 09 exercises, which actually technically Zapad and Ladoga together, were the first major Russian exercises in the northwestern military region since the collapse of communism. And they involved the invasion, the isolation, the occupation of the Baltic states, the use of tactical nuclear weapons while doing so, and just to drive the point home, they were followed up with a strategic rocket forces drill in which the notional target was Warsaw. NATO took some time to react to that. It has now, rather belatedly in my view, but it introduced contingency plans in 2008, but it actually has now put some meat on those contingency plans and is having for the very first time a proper NATO exercise this autumn, Steadfast Jazz. Unfortunately, many NATO countries regard even the existence of this exercise as deeply provocative to Russia, and their main aim, or their main input into the exercise is to try and make it as unthreatening as possible for Russia, to make sure that Russia has the maximum possible observers. And also, the same countries, including a very large country which has a Baltic Sea coast, begins with G, is not only trying to make steadfast jazz as ineffective as possible, it's also not contributing anything. The single biggest contributor to steadfast jazz is France, which is interesting and quite commendable until you realise that the reason the French are doing it is that they want to sell nuclear power stations to the Poles, and they realise that this is a good way of getting the Poles to take them seriously. So I think it's pretty bleak at the moment. I think we actually have all the ingredients that we need. We have the best functioning economies and societies in Europe. We have a very strong soft power story to tell if we chose to tell it, although we don't. We actually have very strong military capabilities. If we put the Nordic and Baltic defence budgets together, it would be a very strong military power, and it would have there would be no need to worry about Russia, because it's divided between 8 countries, all spending on rather ineffective ways. This is not very effective. I think the final point I'd finish on is that, and it's one of the weaknesses of a gathering like this, is that everybody is very keen that other countries should do the politically impossible. And so we, as I've just done, we lecture the Latvians and Lithuanians on why they should spend more on defence. The Latvians and Lithuanians lecture the Swedes and Finns on why they should join NATO when the population in those countries is strongly against it. Everybody lectures the Americans on why they should devote more resources to Europe. The Europeans lecture the Americans on why they should spend more in Europe. And we carry on lecturing each other. And meanwhile, as I just said, the problem from the East gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and nobody wants to talk about it, and nobody wants to deal with it.
Thank you, Edward, for that rather gloomy presentation. You say that there is no Baltic security complex, and yet you say that we are all in the same boat. Isn't that contradictory?
Well, I think that you're all in the same boat, but the people in the countries concerned don't think they're all in the same boat. And there is a large chunk of the population in Sweden and Finland which is extremely nervous about joining NATO and extremely nervous about any sort of foreign military entanglement. And I think from the Finnish point of view, particularly, it's extremely understandable. The most traumatic event in their geopolitical history involved being abandoned by other countries. And I have to say, as a Brit, it's one of the worst things we ever did, but we declared war on Finland. And I think that, that there's a deep historical trauma there. On the Swedish side, one could perhaps call it smugness rather than trauma, but the idea that the world is a wicked and evil place, but luckily it doesn't affect Sweden. And the common threat perception is not yet there. And I think also in the Baltic states, there is a feeling that any Swedish or Finnish involvement in NATO air policing would weaken the NATO security guarantee. There's a kind of NATO or nothing mentality. You actually see this also in Denmark. It's one of the reasons why the Stoltenberg report on Nordic defence cooperation didn't really get anywhere, was that the Danes very strongly believed that anything that isn't NATO weakens NATO. You're in NATO, NATO is the one-size-fits-all, all-purpose security umbrella, and as soon as you start going for supplementary and complementary things, you're actually arguing that NATO doesn't work. And because NATO itself is, I think, now NATO light, it's not the NATO that we had during the Cold War, NATO is not in a position really to deal with this problem on its northeastern flank. And so I think we don't yet have a complex.
I see.
Individual countries have complexes in the psychological sense, but we don't have a complex in the security sense.
I see. We don't spend enough either. How much should we spend?
I think you need to say what's the task. Greece spends a huge amount on defence, but unfortunately it spends a lot on defence. It wants to defend itself against Turkey, which is actually a NATO member. You can spend a lot and spend it inefficiently. You can spend it on salaries, on people in offices, on people who on old-fashioned weapons. You can spend a smaller amount, but spend it effectively. I think the NATO 2% is important as a symbolic target. And I think defence is quite expensive. But I think if you pool your defence, you get more bang for your buck. There's no point in everybody having helicopters, everybody having artillery, everybody having warships, everybody having boots on the ground. But I think that if you want to be taken seriously within NATO, you have to spend the 2%. And Estonia does that. Estonia, in fact, is the only country that's in the EU and NATO, which meets both the EU rules and NATO rules. It meets the NATO 2% target and it meets the EU rules on debt and deficit. That's pretty weak. There are a couple other NATO countries that spend their 2%, but unfortunately they're a long way away from the Baltic.
I see. Thank you, Edward. We'll get back to you. Now it's time for Mike Winnerstig.
Thank you. At this conference, I'm representing only myself and the Swedish Academy of the War Sciences. I want to make a more kind of a conceptual approach on the issue of the security complex. I will start with a more kind of optimistic tone, though, than Edward's pretty gloomy perspective, just to get some change at least, because I agree with much of what Edward said, almost most of it, but almost the whole of it, but you can add a few other things as well. The Baltic Sea right now is a very kind of tranquil sea. There are nobody here, I think, who expects any form of military forceful events happening anytime soon. It's a Mare Nostrum, more or less, for both NATO and the European Union. They dominate everything that has to do with both trade and security and other issues as well. The American presence in Europe, which is supposed to be very much diminished according to the pivot or the so-called rebalancing of US forces, is actually very, very limited. It's less than 10% of the current posture, or the posture of last year, rather. According to the last figures from US European Command in Stuttgart that I got the other week, the force in Europe for the United States Armed Forces will be about 74,000 troops of all kinds. And additionally, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, has 20,000 people on permanent basis in Europe, which gives you the total number of more than 94,000 Americans related to security and defense issues permanently stationed in Europe. That's quite a lot of people, actually. So that's the good part of it. We do have potential problems here, of course. The Russian arms buildup is, in the long term, by far the most worrying. We can't really just sit and look when another country spends the equivalent of $70 billion a year on military equipment alone before we start to do something. It's going to be very worrying for most countries involved. And regardless of the fact that 30% or more of this might go off in corruption, it's still going to be a tremendous lot of new things, new military equipment and capabilities that will be partly directly stationed or based on our kind of eastern border, with our, in this case, I mean the whole Nordic-Baltic area. And also with the increased Russian capability in expeditionary warfare, the fact that they base a lot of these new things and these new troops in other places, like in the east, for example, means that they will pretty easily be able to ship all this stuff or parts of it over to another place if need be. Then we have, of course, the mutually problematic issue of NATO missile defense, which is essentially a United States system. This is used as a pretext, I would say, technically speaking at least, by the Russians to argue that NATO is bad and the US is even worse. And this is something that will continue to be a problem as long as it is implemented. So we do have problems here, and these are only the more strategic ones, so to speak. We have other local problems related to the minority issues in the Baltic states, not only the Russian one, but also, for example, the Polish minority in Lithuania, which is a big problem for Polish-Lithuanian relations right now. For unclear reasons to me, but that's the case, unfortunately. So we wanted to, or I in an earlier project last year, wanted to develop some kind of a conceptual framework for this very situation. And that's where we came up with the issue of the security complex. So this is not a Freudian kind of psychological issue. It was developed back in the 80s by Barry Buzan, a famous British professor of international relations. And it's a pretty easy and simple thing. It depicts a number of states in the same regional area who have or which have principal security interests that are so interlinked that they cannot be analyzed or dealt with separately. which is to say not necessarily that they are mutually interdependent, as it's a common other form of buzzword in this business, but that they are affected by each other. If something bad happens in one state, then the repercussions of that will affect other countries as well. And secondly, in this kind of framework, local issues might have strategic consequences. And this goes back to the issue of minorities, for example. It's very problematic what we hear from Minister Parbrix, for example, about military camps with ethnic groups from one country having military training essentially in another country. That's worrying for most people in this business. And also, of course, high-level problems can lead to local consequences as well. However, though, the issue of having these interlinked security interests is a new experience for countries like Sweden and Finland. During the whole Cold War years, the official explicit policy of both Sweden and Finland, but especially Sweden, I would say, was actually to stay out of other people's conflicts. And essentially it was a very isolationist kind of policy, saying that the rest of the world might burn down as long as we save ourselves. This is fine with us, to put it a little bit mean, but still that was the essence of the policy of non-alignment at the time. And this is not the case anymore. Sweden has, through the EU, a sort of a already political alliance with military aspects, if you wish. We have declared the Solidarity Declaration in 2009 ourselves, which is an Article 5 light, if you wish, where we are saying that we should come to other people's rescue, other people's meaning the Nordic states and the EU state, which is almost 30 countries actually, which includes the Baltic states as well. And we expect them as well to come to our rescue should we be attacked. So things are happening here and happening pretty quickly as well. The question is whether, if you have this kind of a security complex, what's the next phase? Could something be done in terms of getting it more mature or whatever? And in the theoretical literature, you have another concept which is a follow-on, so to speak, to the security complex issue, which is called the security community. And this means that you not only have interlinked interests, you also have a shared value system, you have shared threat perceptions, and shared ways and means of dealing with these threat perceptions. And that is, I would say, the big thing in front of us right now. And Minister Parbrix was very frank and, in my mind, totally correct in his saying that one of the key issues right now with the Nordic Baltic 8 countries is that as long as they don't belong to the same major organizational frameworks, we will always be hampered and the cooperation will always be hindered to a very, very large extent, almost to a full extent when it comes to military territorial defense issues, for example. And that means essentially that if we are going to develop this idea of a security complex to something else and something better, that would better protect our security and freedom, our kind of territorial issues, together with all the others in the NB8 concept, the Nordic Baltic 8 concept, then, of course, we need to start the discussion right now, not only in Sweden and Finland about NATO membership. That debate is already ongoing. It's actually not a majority right now, Ed, against NATO membership in Sweden. It's about 40%, whereas 32% are for, so the gap is narrowing. In Finland, the figures are more different, but this also deals with Norway and the issue of Norwegian membership in the European Union. Because I don't want to dismiss the European Union here. I do it happily when it comes to military purposes, but when it comes to other things, very important ones for the Baltic states, take the ability of Lithuania, for example, to deal with Gazprom from a Brussels perspective and the way they use the European Commission's rules against Gazprom monopolization of their own gas problems, for example. This is a very good asset. The EU is a great organization when it comes to certain things of great importance in this business. So we all need to deal with both organizations and both frameworks, and essentially the NB8 countries will do a much, much better job of all these kind of things if everybody was included in these organizations. That's my major message here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. One brief question. do only experts believe in a security complex? Edward mentioned that the people don't.
I think that most people here, for example, have been increasing their, let's say, consciousness about the Baltic states. We had a very kind of, which was very much related to our own policy during the Cold War, a very kind of distant relationship to the Baltic peoples until 1989, essentially, or even longer, actually. But that is changing. I mean, people are moving here. We have a very active diplomatic circuit here. We have, for example, right now, the Lithuanian embassy in Stockholm is the NATO contact point embassy for Sweden, which means that a number of issues that NATO does here in this town is run by the Lithuanian embassy, which is another way of kind of promoting intercultural, interpolitical linkages.
So you think that a Swede feels closer to someone from Lithuania than from France, for instance?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, it's more on the other way around, actually. The Baltic states right now want to become Nordic very much. That's a stated goal of their policies. And just to give a funny example, I was invited last year to dinner at the Lithuanian ambassador's residence, and he had a top-level guy from the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. And he told us, the guests, that Lithuania now really wants to become a Nordic country. We see you as a real kind of example in the world in terms of how you deal with things societally and culturally and in many other ways. But it's completely against our genes. We're Catholics, we're Central Europeans rather than Nordic Europeans. We have had a big empire together with Poland for many years, looking at Ukraine and so on. We have had very little to do with you before, or rather, if you look at the time of Sigismund, the Swedish king, who was also king of Poland and Lithuania, that was about the last time, and that was many hundred years ago. And there is a movement on the other hand. I think that most people still here would see that they are more kind of related to Western Europeans than the Baltic states, but it's slowly changing in my mind.
Thank you. You mentioned tensional problems and in particular Russia's increased military spending. But we hear from our own foreign minister, for instance, that Russia is no threat. Why should we be afraid?
Well, it's not a threat today in any conceivable sense. Today, meaning today, this very week. But on the other hand, if they do what they say that they will do, which we don't know, namely to spend the next 10 years' time about somewhere between $600 and $700 billion on military equipment, their abilities will become much stronger. And even 10 years from now, I would not expect them to invade somebody. It's not that we're dealing with. I would expect them, though, to be much more forceful in terms of following their own agendas and their own interests. And they could actually also use the new military capabilities to threat other people to abstain from doing things. I'm not talking about invasions here. That's old school, you know. But there are other ways of using your military capabilities for intimidation purposes and other things. And I think that the current statements by the foreign minister here in Stockholm, Carl Bildt, is essentially relating to the situation of today, not the situation 10 years down the road.
Okay, thank you. I know that Edward has some comments. However, I will let Anna speak first. Anna Jardfelt, who is the director of the Swedish Institute for International Affairs.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for inviting me to this conference. When it comes to these terms that I think Mike has very clearly explained, also security complex and security community, these are terms that have re-emerged in the field of European security over the last few years. For instance, and it's not only related to the Nordic-Baltic region. For instance, in 2010, the Astana summit, the OSCE summit in Astana, they adopted their document from that summit, and saying that for the 57 participating states of the OSCE, there should be the ambition to create and work towards creating a security community for this whole area. So it is a concept that is very actively used now in European security terms. But when it comes to creating a security community, this can only be done by involving society and engagement in society from all different levels. And here, of course, an organization like the OSCE is facing completely different challenges than the Nordic-Baltic countries together. And what I wanted to talk about today is two things. First, talk a little bit about Nordic-Baltic cooperation in general, why it works, and then also mention a few things that could indicate why this would become even more important for the future. I would say that Nordic-Baltic cooperation today is something unique. And one reason, I think, is because it has a very firm basis in our societies. It is seen as normal that the Nordic-Baltic countries should work together. And I think even though we have chosen different constellations for our security purposes, and today it's only, out of the 8, it's only Estonia that is members both of NATO, of the EU, and of the Eurozone. Still, we cooperate because it's easy, it's pragmatic, and it is because we have things in common. And we are doing this so well that Nordic-Baltic security cooperation today serves as an example also for other regions, such as the Visegrad 4. When it comes to the cooperation on security issues between our countries, this happens on all levels. It is the growing cooperation in NORDEFCO, but it's also when it comes to academic settings, but also in political settings. Here, for instance, we have the EPINE format, where the 8 Nordic-Baltic academic institutions, such as my institute, meet together once a year or even twice a year, together with the political directors of the different countries. And in this EPINE format, also the United States is included. But I think also today, as we speak more or less, there is the Foreign Affairs Council happening in Brussels. And also before every EU Foreign Affairs Council, the Nordic-Baltic countries meet informally to go over the agenda. And I think this kind of informal meetings can only happen with friends that you feel that you have really things in common with. And I think that any kind of deepening of this Nordic-Baltic cooperation must continue to play on these strengths. It must be pragmatic, it must focus on efficiency and also of concrete results. But then why should this cooperation become even more important for the future? I think we have mentioned here also that how the United States see Europe in security terms. It continues to have a very clear significance also for the security of the Nordic-Baltic region. And this transatlantic relationship today, it is changing. Mike was mentioning the pivot or this rebalancing between Asia and Europe that is now happening from the point of view of Washington. And I think we can all agree that even if there is a pivot going on, there are still very big interest from the United States that the United States still has in Europe, not least when it comes to issues such as missile defense. So it's still a focus on security matters in Europe from Washington, but not the same kind of focus maybe as before. But I think that in addition to this geographical rebalancing between Asia and Europe, there are also indications that there is a different type of reassessment, or if you want to use the word rebalancing, taking place in the United States now regarding the American overall interest in Europe. During and after the Cold War, the primary vehicle for the transatlantic link, it has been NATO. This has reflected a focus across the Atlantic on hard security issues. A primary demand from the United States on Europe has been that they want us to spend more on military equipment. And I'm sure that this is a request that still stands, and Washington do not want to continue to pay over 75% of the NATO budget, leaving on average 1% of the rest for each of the other alliance members. But I think that this number one demand maybe is going to change for the future. Some experts, for instance, we had Professor Dan Hamilton from Johns Hopkins who visited UE last week. They insist that this new rebalancing of the US-NATO, of the US-EU relationship that is happening now is going to have a very direct effect also on NATO as the primary vehicle for this transatlantic link.